everybody, and you are, as the teachers say, a mixed ability audience. Some of you will know the history of Chartism inside out, while some of you, understandably, may have little idea. If you weren't taught it at school, then how would you know? I have in my hand a bottle of Stroud Brewery Chartist beer. How so? Why so? How come? Remember the name John Frost as this show presentation unfolds. Remember the name John Frost. A short factual prologue about Chartism. A working class movement of the 1830s and 40s that wanted to establish democracy in this country at a time when only the aristocracy and middle class men had the vote. It was based upon 6 points. The secret ballot, so there could be no intimidation. Payment of MPs, so that working people could stand. Same-size constituencies, to prevent the old rural aristocracy lording it over the new industrial towns. Ending the ownership of property rule to become an MP so that working people could stand. Votes for all men over 21. However, there were Chartist groups, even back then, in favour of votes for women. Annual parliaments, so that governments would keep their promises. All but one of these is now the law, of course. But you could easily end up in prison in Chartist times for supporting these ideas, lose your freedom, your job, and your home for wanting a democratic government. It's time to remember these freedom fighters and rescue them from what E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity. And so this show, our counter-heritage rescuing of 2 special working people from the enormous condescension of posterity. George Shell of Newport and Charlotte Alice Bingham of Stroud. This performative presentation was commissioned by the Chartist Convention to commemorate the 1839 Newport Rising in general and the death of George Shell in particular. Parts will be repeated on the anniversary of the Rising next November at 39 minutes past 6 in the evening, 1839, by candlelight in the graveyard of St Woolas Cathedral in Newport. It was there that the dead insurrectionaries were secretly buried at night by the army to prevent any public displays of grief with consequent martyrdom. So circumspect was this military procedure that all the horses' hooves were muffled. Our piece opens with the names of those charged and sentenced, those who were killed, and their list of crimes back in that November day of 1839, when the ruling class viewed the word democracy as pejorative. But first, I wave the first edition of Thomas Cooper's Purgatory of Suicides, a Miltonic creation of great sense and sensibility, written by a Chartist whilst incarcerated in Stafford Prison. And I'm very grateful to Professor Steve Paul of UE, who I think is at the back, for reminding me of the following, penned by Cooper. We do not write history like the glorious old Greeks, or the memory of such a hero as George Shell would not be lost. May not a noble be found in November 1939 or 2039 to commemorate George Shell's death at Newport with equal earnestness as the ancient Greeks? It is not yet 2039, only 2018. But here follows our tribute to George Shell. We may not be noble, but we are earnest. So we now commemorate the death of George Shell. The Newport Rising of 1839, a Newport declamation. These are the women and men of Newport, the charged and imprisoned. Today we remember them. St Leonard of Noblood, patron saint of prisoners. Hear our roll call.
James Aust, Thomas Ball, John Batten,
Richard Benfield, Thomas Bolton and Solomon Britton.
John Britton, Charles Bucknell, Joseph Coles.
John Charles, Di the Tinker,
Thomas Davis, Isaac Davis and Thomas Davis again.
William Davis, Thomas Davis.
Edmund Edmonds, Samuel Etheridge,
And Evan Edwards and Thomas Edwards and John Fisher.
Edward Frost, John Frost. George George, John Gibby.
John Job Harris, Harry Harris, William Harvard,
Moses Horner, William Horner and Thomas Keyes.
William Jones, Thomas Lewis, John Lewis Llewellyn.
Thomas Llewellyn, William Llewellyn, John Lovell,
Jack the Piper, Amy Meredith, James Meredith.
James Moore, Jacob Morgan, Thomas Morgan.
John Owen, John Partridge, Isaac Phillips, John Ross,
Benjamin Richards, Edwin Richards and Lewis Rowland.
William Shallard, George Tomlins Thompson.
George Turner, also known as George Cole,
Frederick Turner, Charles Waters and David Williams.
Ebenezer Williams, William Williams, Zephaniah Williams.
And at the going down of the sun, and in the business of this busy Stroud afternoon, we shall also hear an echo from the roll call of the dead.
Collier men, Evan Davis and William Faraday, and Abraham Thomas.
Miners, such as William Evans and John Morris.
Men of stout heart, such as John Codd and David Davies.
And John Jonathan and William Griffiths.
Robert Lansdowne and Rhys Meredith and William Williams.
And Isaac Thomas of Nantiglow.
And John the Roller of Nantiglow.
The Tinker, David Morgan, William Aberdare.
Private Williams, deserter, 29 foot.
And the carpenter, John Davis.
And the cabinet maker, young George Shell of Pontypool.
Now the crimes of these men and women, as defined by the time in which they lived, included high treason, burglary, high treason and sedition, being illegally armed, making bullets, being armed with guns, spears and other offensive weapons, unlawful combination and confederacy, assault, conspiracy and riotous assembly. Now the causes for which these men and women suffered imprisonment now constitute the law of the land. The causes for which these men and women were incarcerated, transported, sentenced to death by hanging, jawing and quartering, also now constitute the law of the land. Let the living answer the roll call of the dead. You are about to hear some manuscripts which have only come to light in Stroud in the past year. They are dated both November the 5th, 1839. They were found within the family Bible, alongside various ephemera and memorabilia within the vintage shop, the Wild Boar, at the top of the High Street. It's closed now. John Frost had been selected in March 1839 to stand as the prospective Chartist candidate for the 1841 general election in Stroud, to stand against Lord John Russell, the Lord John and Russell Street, Lord John Russell, he was Home Secretary. And this link might explain why these manuscripts came to light in that basket in the Wild Boar at the top of the High Street in Stroud last year.
I write this with melancholy, heavy heart, one day after the death of George Shell. I've tried to be faithful to the words he uttered to me as I nursed and comforted him through his anguished, slow path to death. My darling, dear love spoke more than words, however. He had a parchment about his person that he passed to me when the soldiers looked away behind. Smoke and fire and shot had tarnished the words and made many indecipherable. The manuscript had also been ripped asunder and required much conjecture and inference after the heavy rains. But George Shell and I had spent many days together before that fateful day, and I kept much of our colloquy preserved within the pages of my diary. That diary has now been cast to the flames, but lines, paragraphs, and indeed whole pages have contributed to this history. He said much in those 3 hours of agony, much that made little sense. And there were many imprecations, adjudications, and execrations that I've omitted. But some of his dying disquisitions have been included in my narrative. I've tried to be faithful to those words. I've also added my own retrospective. I slipped his manuscript under my bonnet when soldiers looked behind them in alarum. I accordingly made pretence of adjusting my ribbons for deception and dissimulation. The smoke aided my deference and put to posterity. The manuscript was safely secreted. So in short, and in consequence, some of the following is from George Shell's pen, some verbatim, some from my textual interpretations, some mine own retrospection, and some derived from memory, diary, and recollection. It has been compiled as a spun and woven tapestry of sorts, but with the hope and wish that it reads as though the words are those of George Shell. He then lives on, rather than dying in vain.
I lodged with Mr. Cecil once I got my new carpentering job in Pontypool. A cabinet maker, aye, and a breaker of government cabinets if I had my way. 18 years of age, I think, or thereabouts, and ready for anything. I was on good terms with all and sundry round about, but most enjoyed a cup of tea when meeting with the Howell family. I used to dandle young George Howell on my knee. "Why is George crying?" I heard him say. "Because he's breathing the pure air of liberty," his mother said. "That air is like paradise, and so you cry the tears of happiness." I shook the hands of all my friends and neighbours on that November day. It kept me warm and kept my nerves at bay. The rain wouldn't dampen my spirits. Ardour was the call of the day, and the valleys heard well the call to valour and ardour. Our fight would be the sign for England itself to rise up. I had joined a Chartist youth lodge in the years previous. Our valleys in towns and villages were happy homes to Chartist lodges, and women's lodges too. Proselytizers were 2 a farthing coin, membership vast, yet our discipline was of an efficacy comparable to the army itself. Our musketry was ready and waiting. We were organised into sections with a captain each. I was a captain myself. Then into troops, companies and brigades. We drilled resolutely, and our mass meetings were a sight to behold and intimidate. With deserters from the army on our side too, our militia would be a match for anyone. We made a noble sight, with many a fearless, handsome, yet modest man in our throng. A throng, I say, some throng, 5,000 of us to march on Newport from the heads of the valleys on the fateful rain and windswept night of November the 3rd. From field and furnace and forge and kitchen and colliery we streamed forth. But the morrow was to change my well-regarded features at a shot, you might say. We marched in our bands with our staves, scythes, sickles, swords, muskets, pistols, pikes, knives, picks, firearms, hoes, hatchets, axes, pitchforks, bludgeons, mandrills, billhooks, spears and sledgehammers. The caves about had made tidy hiding holes. We streamed into Newport like rushing rivers, with their forceful and necessary tributaries. We streamed from Vacha, Cumalan, Avanlwyd, Abersychan, Mamhilad, Chevidin, Benwethdy, Bargoed, Aberbeeg, and Abercar. Ebu, Morifusloin, Bedwas, Aberstwp, Marchan, Risca, Weinheligan, Tredegar, Blaena, Merthyr, Pontypool, Nantigo, Cwmtilleri, Aberdare, Pycona, Bellevue, Sir Howie, Chrumney, Blackwood, Rogerstone, Brynmawr, Pogwynfraith, Fleur-de-Lis, Crumlin, Newbridge, Blaenavon, Croesykiliog, Llantarnam. We were wet through and fatigued after a night's rain and marching, but my courage was firm and my heart was strong as I marched for dear freedom. But at times I was a tumble with the image of my dear parents sitting in their chairs right there in my sodden head. I saw them gazing into each other's eyes, reading my letter to each other in turns. Dear parents, I hope this will find you well, as I am myself at present. I shall this night be engaged in a struggle for freedom, and should it please God to spare my life, I shall see you soon. But if not, grieve not for me, I shall fall in a noble cause. My tools are at Mr. Cecil's, and likewise my clothing. Farewell. Yours truly, George Shell. Alas, we were late in our arrival at Newport. John Frost had led our comrades up to the church, there to be obstructed by a line of the special constables. The Chartist militia marched, in consequence, down Stow Hill at dawn towards the West Gate. The demand was for the release of our fellows, incarcerated as prisoners by the authorities in the Westgate Hotel. Alas, a detachment of the 45th Regiment, together with more special constables, were primed, ready to fire behind the shuttered windows of the hotel. The reading of the Riot Act was immaterial. What was material was the slew of shots and musket balls and bullets that issued forth from the hotel. I forced my way in with mates and got into the corridors. I was angry and vehement, it's true, but vengeance and justice were not my only motivations. I wanted to speak with the mayor about his perfidy. I can see the soldiers, even now, aiming their rifles at me in cold-hearted, single-minded concentration. Through the smoke, the tumult, and acridity, I received several mortal shots, jolting my chest and torso as though I were just a jack in the box.
It took George Shell 3 agonizing hours to die. That felt like an eternity of pain and anguish.
England will still rise, won't it, Charlotte? For we are many, they are few, just like you always said.
Through my sobbing tears, I whispered, "That's so, George Shell. We are many, they are few." And so, George at last expired, amidst the groans and cries and piercing shrieks of the dying and the wounded. His face, now pale like a wraith, his blood dripping down the corridors and passageways to ooze into the stream of that of his comrades, but with the faint ghost of a smile on his countenance.
Yes, Charlotte, ye are many, they are few, just like you always said.
Charlotte Alice Bingham, November the 5th, 1839. I first met George Shell in the spring of 1839, after I'd moved to Newport from Stroud. I was previously a resident of Rodborough, a village contiguous to Stroud. I was brought up to be a spinner by trade, but my parents had also ensured that I had facility and felicity with both reading and writing. This, combined with my reading of the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, and a vindication of the rights of women, together with the trade depression in the cloth trade, and the poems of Mr. Shelley, all led me to wonder of radical thinking and inveterate questioning. The loss of faith in the church was just one mere strand. Thus it was that I walked up the hill to hear John Frost speak up at Rodborough Common at Easter, when 3,000 of us hazarded his nomination as the vanquisher of Russell at the next election. In addition, Mr. Frost was gracious enough to allow me to quiz him about the Charter and women's suffrage. The only women's suffrage group in the Five Valleys was in distant Woodland-under-Edge. When he told me of the plenitude of Chartist women's lodges in South Wales, I resolved to move there. It was that I made my way to Gloucester, and thence to Newport, thence to the Chartist Ladies' Tea Party at the Ship and Pilot, and so to George Shell. I earned my way as a peripatetic governess of sorts, teaching the rudiments to children, men and women of the lodges. I also led more elevated discussions on the poetry of Shelley, Byron, Milton and John Clare. So it was that I was out one day, walking the lanes, admiring the primroses and violets and bluebells, declaiming a few lines from Mr. Clare, when I almost bumped into a youth coming towards me. I was oblivious of his presence, transported as I was, but George introduced himself with a courteous apology, even though the fault was all mine. He inquired after my volume. He asked me to read him a few lines, and I responded. So it was that our initial discourse led to friendship and discussions about poetry, about politics, about religion, about atheism. And so it was that we became the secret man and wife in all but name, wandering the fields and hedgerows to couple. Summer turned to autumn, and John Clare turned to John Keats. But there was to be no rural idyll for us as man and wife. George spent increasing time preparing for the great day, and all with my blessing, support and encouragement. The Charter was, and is, all. So it was that George and I saw less of each other as the days shortened. I wandered the fields alone, sometimes losing my steadfastness with pessimism and silent tears for George. But then George's image would come to my mind, smiling and whispering in gentle exhortation. No need to cry, my love. We are many. They are few. We must always remember that. That's what you always say, isn't it? We last met at the end of that month. Neither of us are believers in a Christian God, but we both felt that our love was such that somehow it would persist if George were to be killed in the coming days. And if arrested, I would wait. And if transported, I would follow. The Charter would constitute our symbolic wedding bands. We would meet in some paradise, if not the Christian one, a paradise without rich and poor, with equality between the classes, with equality between women and men. And I swore that I too would give my life for the cause if George were to fall. But when I saw George fall, I screamed and wailed like a lost soul, all resolution lost in a moment. I sank to the ground, beat the cobbles in bereft despair until some helping hand got me to my feet and my senses. I made my way through the serried ranks of Confederates and the spectators, as though in a trance, and through the stable yard to throw myself down by George to nurse his wounds. But staunching was impossible. Thus it was that we shared our last words, exchanged kisses, and I retrieved the manuscript. My hope is that my beloved somehow heard or read my lips' last words before I was pulled away, drenched in his tender blood, the blood of freedom. George, I am with child. I have no regrets. We are many, they are few. That's what I always say, isn't it, George? When my nerves allow, and when we find George's resting place, I shall place flowers on his grave. May the flower of England never blow, the Clyde of Scotland cease to flow, the harp of Ireland never play, until the Chartists gain the day. Charlotte Alice Bingham, November the 5th, 1839.
Bingham is of course, a common name in Stroud and its 5 others. I must get around to checking the 1841 census for Stroud and the Valleys. There is no Charlotte Alice Bingham in the 1841 census in or around Newport. It might also be a worthwhile endeavour to check her name and the child's on the emigration list from Stroud and the 5 others in the 1840s. considerable emigration, some of it persisted, to New South Wales from the Stroud area at that time, the cloth trade being in severe and seemingly irreversible depression. And so ends our eulogy in this entirely appropriate setting of Lansdowne. This presentation was first performed as part of the Festival of Flowers at Newport at St Woolas Cathedral, and as part of and for National Democracy Week. As I said at the beginning, back then in 1839, of course, the word democracy was a pejorative to the governing classes. But George's short life, and that of Charlotte Alice, remind us that yesterday's minority is tomorrow's majority. We now all have the vote over 21, but the struggles continue. And today's minority can still be tomorrow's majority. There is a beautifully illustrated booklet by Deb Roberts available with the text of this performance, and that's available in the corners. And if anyone wishes to discuss the research involved in the writing of this, then I shall be in the Little George and the Ale House later on today. And before I release you from bondage, my brother has to scurry very, very quickly up to the Ale House where he has an Alan Bennett talking head show. But ladies and gentlemen, our eulogy is now at an end. Thank you. And now